The first thing Brent Callahan said to me that night was, "You ever killed anybody?" The entire backyard went quiet except for the hiss of fat dripping onto Rick's grill. Somebody laughed nervously. Another beer bottle clinked against a patio table. I kept cutting my steak. Medium rare. Too much pepper. Texas men loved over-seasoning meat almost as much as they loved hearing themselves talk. Only when I had to, I said. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't look up. Just answered. Across the patio, somebody muttered, "Jesus!" Brent grinned wider, leaning back in his chair like he'd just found entertainment for the evening. "Oh, yeah," he said. "What were you then?" That was when I looked up. Navy SEALs. Rick nearly inhaled a mouthful of beer. A couple people burst out laughing immediately. Brent slapped the table. "Oh, that's rich." But his father didn't laugh. Old Walt Callahan froze beside the cooler, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost walk through the fence gate. Then the beer slipped from his hand and shattered across the concrete. Nobody moved. Walt kept staring at me. Finally, he looked at his son and said quietly, "Son, wrong woman." That dinner happened 8 months after I married Rick Mercer. Second marriage for both of us. We were older people trying to build softer lives after years that had already taken enough out of us. Rick was 63, retired HVAC contractor. Big shoulders, kind eyes, too eager to please everybody around him. I was 58, and for most of our marriage he believed I had spent my life doing office work for the government, which technically wasn't a lie. That was the safest kind of truth. We lived outside San Antonio in a quiet subdivision where every driveway had either a pickup truck, a fishing boat, or both. Rick loved neighborhood cookouts, loved football Sundays, loved having loud friends over. I tolerated it because after enough years around gunfire and screaming radios and helicopter blades, normal noise felt healthy, even healing. At first that evening had been ordinary. Steaks on the grill, country music low on the patio speakers, mosquito candles burning, the women talking about grandchildren, the men arguing over football and gas prices. Then Brent started drinking heavier. Brent was one of those men who got meaner the more attention he needed. Late 50s, red face, expensive sunglasses pushed on top of his head even after sunset. The type who introduced himself with old high school football stories nobody asked for. He liked making people uncomfortable, especially women, especially quiet women. I noticed early on he kept watching me every time I spoke, or didn't speak. "You're awful calm," he said at one point. "I like listening. That usually means somebody's hiding something." Rick laughed like Brent was joking. I didn't. Men like Brent spent their whole lives confusing silence with weakness. Then came the steak comment. He watched how I cut my food. Precise. Controlled. Years ago, one instructor had once screamed at us during survival training. "Slow hands survive longer. Funny what stays with you. You cut steak like a surgeon," Brent said. "Or a serial killer." Everybody chuckled. Then came the question. "You ever killed anybody?" And suddenly the whole evening tilted sideways. After Walt dropped the beer bottle, nobody seemed sure what to say next. Rick forced a laugh. "Well, hell," he said, "Diane's full of surprises tonight." Brent smirked. "You serious?" "Yes." "No offense," he said, "but there weren't exactly many female Navy SEALs running around 30 years ago." "That's true. So what did you do, secret ninja missions?" "No," I said calmly, "mostly paperwork." A couple people laughed again, but Walt didn't. He sat down slowly across from me and narrowed his eyes. Vietnam veterans recognize things other people miss. The posture. The scanning. The way someone automatically notices exits. He looked at my hands, then at the faded scar near my wrist. Fast rope burn. Old. White. Nearly invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. "Where'd you train?" he asked quietly. "Coronado." That ended the laughter. Not entirely, but enough. Brent shifted in his chair. Rick looked confused now instead of amused. The women stopped talking altogether. I took another bite of steak. Honestly, I regretted saying anything. I'd spent decades learning how not to talk about myself. People think veterans stay quiet because they're mysterious. Most of us stay quiet because explaining things gets exhausting, especially the parts that never fully leave you. Brent recovered first. "Well," he said loudly, "if that's true, remind me never to piss you off." "Good advice," Walt muttered. Brent rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Dad." But Walt kept staring at me. Not scared. Not admiring. Just recognizing. That's different. There's a look combat veterans give each other sometimes. A silent acknowledgement. Like seeing somebody carrying the same invisible weight. Dinner limped along after that. Conversation never fully recovered. People avoided looking directly at me. Rick overcompensated by becoming extra cheerful. Brent drank more, and Walt barely spoke another word. By 9:30, everybody started leaving. Plastic containers packed with leftover potato salad, folded lawn chairs, truck engines starting in the dark. As Brent climbed into his truck, he pointed at me. "We're gonna need proof someday, Diane." I smiled politely. "No, you don't." He laughed like I'd told another joke. But Walt paused beside the passenger door. "You served with honor?" he asked quietly. "Yes, that's enough for me." Then he got into the truck without another word. But inside the house, Rick shut the kitchen door harder than necessary. "What the hell was that?" I rinsed plates calmly. "What part?" "The Navy SEAL thing." "It wasn't a thing." "You never told me that." "You never asked." Rick rubbed both hands over his face. "You serious right now?" "Yes." He stared at me for several long seconds. Then came the sentence I'd heard versions of most of my adult life. "You don't look like somebody who did that kind of stuff." I almost smiled. "What's it supposed to look like?" He had no answer. That wasn't entirely his fault. Most people over 60 grew up with very fixed ideas about women, especially military women. Especially women who learned violence professionally. Rick wasn't cruel, just ordinary. And ordinary people often needed the world to stay understandable. He sighed. Why keep it secret? Because some memories poison rooms once they enter them. Because people stop seeing you normally afterward. Because I wanted one peaceful corner of life that didn't smell like diesel fuel and blood and seawater. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I dried a plate carefully and said it was a long time ago. Rick shook his head slowly and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen another 20 minutes after he left. Old habits, always decompress before sleep, always restore order. Eventually, I stepped into the garage and opened the storage closet near the water heater. In the back sat an old green military footlocker. Scratched metal corners. Faded stenciled numbers. I hadn't opened it since moving into Rick's house. For a long moment, I just stood there looking at it. Then I lifted the lid. Inside rested pieces of another lifetime. Challenge coins. Old photographs. Commendations. A folded flag. And beneath everything, my trident, cold metal against my fingertips. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Then I heard Rick moving around upstairs, so I closed the box again, locked it, and pushed it back into darkness. Before bed, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. "Unknown number," I answered. Brent's voice came through laughing. "Poker night next Saturday," he said. "Bring your war stories." Then he hung up, and for the first time in years, I had a feeling trouble was coming. I almost didn't go to Brent's poker night. At my age, you learn the difference between peace and pride. Peace lets you sleep. Pride keeps you replaying arguments at 3 in the morning. But Rick wouldn't let it go. For 6 straight days, the atmosphere inside our house felt stretched tight like old fishing line ready to snap. Not loud, not hateful, just uncomfortable. Rick kept pretending things were normal while obviously studying me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way I folded towels. The way I checked mirrors before backing out of the driveway. The way I sat facing restaurant entrances. Little things he'd lived beside for months without noticing. Now suddenly they all meant something. Thursday night he finally asked the question directly. "So what exactly did you do?" We were sitting on the back porch while cicadas screamed from the trees. I kept my eyes on the yard. Government work. "Diane." "What?" "You know what?" I sighed softly. "There are things I can talk about and things I can't." "That sounds ridiculous." "It probably does." Rick leaned back in his chair hard enough to make it creak. "I married you." "Yes, and I barely know you." That one landed harder than I expected, because underneath the frustration, he wasn't entirely wrong. After my first husband died in Desert Storm, I spent years becoming someone survival required. Compartmentalized. Controlled. Careful. You don't spend decades in classified operations and suddenly transform into an open book at 58. Some doors stay welded shut. Not because you're hiding lies, because opening them changes the temperature of every room. "I'm still me," I said quietly. Rick rubbed his jaw. "I don't even know if any of this is real." I looked at him then. "You think I invented it?" "I think Brent says women lie about military stuff online all the time." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because somehow a loudmouth with a Facebook account had become more believable than the woman sleeping beside him. Rick immediately regretted saying it. I saw it in his face. But pride is a stubborn thing in older men, especially when their friends are involved. "He invited us Saturday," Rick said carefully. "I know. Maybe if you go, this whole thing clears itself up." There it was. He wanted me verified, like a car title or a hunting license. I stood slowly. If your trust depends on Brent Callahan approving me, I said you have bigger problems than I thought. Then I went inside. Saturday evening arrived hot and humid. Texas heat that clung to your skin even after sunset. Brent's house sat farther outside town on a patch of property with oversized trucks parked everywhere and country music blasting from outdoor speakers. The smell hit first. Cigars, beer, charcoal smoke. Men trying too hard to relive younger versions of themselves. Rick looked nervous as we walked toward the patio. You don't have to prove anything, he said. That's good, I replied, because I'm not going to. But the moment we stepped through Brent's back gate, I knew exactly what this was. An ambush disguised as hospitality. 6 men sat around a long outdoor poker table. 3 wore veteran caps. One had an old Marine Corps tattoo fading down his forearm. Another carried himself with the unmistakable stiffness of someone whose knees no longer forgave airborne jumps. And at the center sat Brent, grinning like a man who believed he controlled the evening. There she is, he announced loudly, America's deadliest grandma. A couple men chuckled awkwardly. Walt sat off to the side near the porch swing, drinking iced tea instead of beer tonight. The moment he saw me, he gave the smallest nod. Respectful. Quiet. I nodded back. Brent dealt cards aggressively. Come on, Diane, he said. Sit down. Tell us about your secret spy adventures. I was never a spy. Even better. Rick sat beside me looking miserable already. One of the older men extended his hand politely. Tom Alvarez, he said, retired Air Force. Diane Mercer. His handshake paused slightly, not because of my name, because of my grip. Another thing training never fully removes. He studied me more carefully afterward. The game started. Cards slapped table felt. Ice clinked in glasses. Brent kept steering every conversation back toward me. So what weapon did you use? Depends. Depends on what? The year. That earned a few sideways glances. Brent smirked. Okay then, what's the difference between a clip and a magazine? About 50 years of annoying conversations. Tom barked out a laugh before he could stop himself. Brent frowned. He kept going. Military acronyms. Deployment jargon. Chain of command trivia. Half of it sounded pulled from action movies. I answered calmly when necessary. Ignored him when possible. But the room kept changing slowly. The veterans there stopped smiling. Stopped treating it like entertainment. Because real recognizes real eventually. Then Brent crossed the line. You know, he said loudly while tossing chips forward, women mostly did desk work back then anyway. Nobody answered. He leaned back. Or warmed beds for lonely officers. The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut skin. Walt closed his eyes briefly. Tom set his cards down very carefully. And somewhere deep inside me, a very old part woke up. Not anger. Colder than anger. The calm you develop before dangerous things happen. I looked directly at Brent. You should stop talking now. He grinned wider. Touch a nerve. No, I said, I'm trying to help you. Brent laughed loudly. Oh, please. Then Tom spoke quietly from across the table. What team? The question changed the air instantly. Not casual anymore. Professional. Measured. I studied him a second before answering. DEVGRU. Nobody moved. Rick looked confused. Brent blinked twice. Tom slowly leaned back in his chair. The former Marine beside him lowered his beer. And Walt muttered under his breath, Lord have mercy. Brent forced a laugh. What the hell's DEV? Don't, Tom interrupted sharply. First sharp thing he'd said all night. Brent stared at him. Tom looked at me again. Not challenging now. Evaluating. Then his eyes dropped briefly to the pale scar near my wrist. Fast rope burn. Recognition flickered immediately. You were operational, he said softly. Yes. How long? Long enough. The Marine finally spoke. You in Afghanistan? Yes. Iraq? Yes. Nobody joked anymore. Rick looked like the ground underneath him had shifted. Because suddenly the room no longer sounded impossible. It sounded plausible. And plausible was worse. Brent swallowed hard but kept pushing anyway. Men like him never stop when they should. They double down. So prove it, he said. I looked at him calmly. You really don't want me to. He spread his arms dramatically. See, that's what fake people always say. I stood slowly from the poker table. Every instinct in Rick's body tensed beside me. Not because he feared I'd attack Brent. Because something in the atmosphere suddenly felt dangerous. I leaned down slightly toward Brent. Not threatening. Not loud. Just close enough that only he could hear clearly. You have spent your whole life mistaking restraint for weakness, I said. Then I straightened again. And for the first time that evening, Brent looked uncertain. After poker night, Brent Callahan became obsessed with me. Not curious, not skeptical. Obsessed. There's a difference. Curious people ask questions because they want truth. Obsessed people ask questions because they need you to be lying. By Monday morning, he'd already posted 3 jokes about me online. Rick showed me one over breakfast while pretending he wasn't bothered. A badly edited photo of a female action movie character holding a machine gun. Caption: Diane Mercer after surviving another secret mission at Applebee's. Underneath, dozens of laughing comments from men our age trying to impress each other. I sipped coffee quietly. Rick watched my face carefully. You okay? I've survived worse than Facebook. That should have been the end of it. Normal adults eventually lose interest in pointless arguments. But Brent wasn't normal. He needed an audience the way drunks need another drink. And deep down, I think he also needed me to fail because my existence embarrassed him. Men like Brent build their identity around performative toughness. Big trucks, big voices, military stories that somehow grew more heroic every year. Then someone walks in carrying the real thing quietly, and suddenly their whole performance feels flimsy. By Wednesday, he'd started messaging old military contacts online trying to prove I was fake. That part amused me more than it worried me. The internet is full of retired operators who spend their mornings fishing and their afternoons arguing about lawn equipment. Several of them recognized my name immediately. Not publicly. Professionals rarely do things publicly, but private messages started arriving. You okay? Need us involved. Who's the clown? I ignored most of them. The last thing I wanted was attention. Rick didn't understand that. You should defend yourself, he said that evening while watching Brent rant in another Facebook video. Brent sat in his garage wearing tactical gear he clearly bought online. American flag behind him. Fake intensity in his voice. These stolen valor people are everywhere now, he announced dramatically into the camera. I almost laughed at that. Rick muted the video. You're just gonna let him say all that? Yes. Why? Because loud men usually destroy themselves eventually. You just have to give them room. But again, I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I folded laundry while Rick paced around the living room. He stopped suddenly. What exactly was DEVGRU? I kept folding towels. You already looked it up. His silence answered for him. The internet had probably shaken him hard, because now the impossible had names, history, documentation, real operations, real people. You were serious, he said quietly. Yes. Rick sat down heavily in his recliner. I don't know how to process this. That's fair. You could have told me. I could have. He stared at the dark television screen. Did you ever... He stopped. I saved him from finishing. Yes. The room went still. Older Americans understand silence differently than younger people. Silence isn't emptiness. It's weight. Rick swallowed. In combat. Yes. Another long silence. Then he whispered something almost too quiet to hear. My God. I folded the last towel carefully. The movies make it look exciting, I said. It isn't. Rick looked up slowly. What's it like? I thought about that question for a long time. Not because I lacked answers. Because there are too many. It's permanent, I finally said. That was the closest thing to truth most civilians could understand. What? 2 days later, Walt Callahan knocked on our front door. Alone. Rick let him in cautiously. Walt carried a peach pie from some local diner. Old Southern habit. Never arrive empty-handed. I owe your wife an apology, he said immediately. You didn't do anything, Rick replied. Walt looked at me. I should have shut Brent down harder. I motioned toward the kitchen table. It's all right. No, he said quietly. It isn't. We sat together while afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. Walt looked older in daylight. Weathered face. Thick hands. The kind of man America used to produce by the millions. He accepted coffee and held the mug carefully. My son's a fool, he said. Rick gave an uncomfortable chuckle. Walt didn't smile. He spent too much of life pretending to be hard. He looked at me then. You know what gave you away immediately. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Your eyes, he said. I said nothing. Walt nodded slowly. Vietnam boys came home with those same eyes. That stayed with me longer than I expected. Because he was right. Combat changes the speed at which you look at the world. You never fully return to normal civilian softness afterward. Even decades later. Walt set down his coffee. Brent's been using military stories to impress people since high school, he admitted. Claims he did all kinds of contractor work overseas. Did he? Hell no. Rick frowned deeply. What do you mean? Walt sighed heavily. He did 6 months stocking supplies at a base in Kuwait 20 years ago. That's it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Brent talked like a man who'd stormed beaches personally. Walt rubbed his forehead. Now he runs those fake security seminars. That got my attention. What seminars? Preparedness garbage, Walt muttered bitterly. Charges old veterans hundreds of dollars teaching nonsense survival courses. A cold feeling settled quietly into my stomach. Does he use military credentials? All the time. Rick stared. You never said that before. Because I was ashamed, Walt replied. That night after Walt left, I finally searched Brent's business online. Patriot Shield Tactical Solutions. Even the name sounded insecure. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Fake training certifications. Photoshopped images. Fundraisers with vague financial records. He preyed mostly on older veterans. Lonely men looking for brotherhood again. Men willing to trust somebody wearing camouflage and confidence. Rick sat beside me, scrolling silently through the website. Then he whispered, Jesus Christ. I kept reading, then stopped suddenly on one particular image, Brent standing beside a donated service dog program banner. I recognized the charity immediately. Real organization. Good people. Meaning Brent had likely used them without permission. That crossed a line. Rick noticed my expression. What? I looked at him calmly. Your friend's about to have a very bad month. Sus. 3 nights later came the Veterans Fundraiser. Community center outside San Antonio. Cheap coffee. Folding chairs. Flags everywhere. The smell of old cologne and barbecue drifting through the hall. Rick and I attended because Walt personally asked us to. He'll make a scene otherwise, Walt warned. He was right. Brent arrived wearing tactical boots and a black polo stretched tight across his stomach. Halfway through the evening, he grabbed a microphone near the raffle table. Before we continue, he announced loudly, I'd like to welcome America's first female Rambo. Scattered nervous laughter. I stayed seated. Brent grinned wider. Come on, Diane, tell everybody another secret mission story. Walt closed his eyes in exhaustion. Then Brent made his mistake. He pointed directly at me. Ask her anything military. She's basically Navy Batman. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly. Because many men there were real veterans. And real veterans hate being turned into props. I stood slowly. The hall became silent almost immediately. Then I asked Brent one simple question. Where were you stationed in Kandahar? He blinked. Well, multiple areas. Kandahar isn't a country, I said calmly. Silence. An army ranger near the coffee station slowly stood up. Then another veteran near the wall crossed his arms. Brent's face started reddening. I meant the region, he snapped. There is no Kandahar region. Now nobody laughed. Not one person. Then the front doors opened. 2 federal investigators walked inside carrying folders. And one of them said, Brent Callahan. The moment those federal investigators walked into the fundraiser hall, every conversation died. You could actually hear the air conditioner humming above us. One of the investigators held a leather folder against his chest. The other scanned the room until his eyes landed on Brent. Brent Callahan, he repeated. Brent forced a laugh immediately. Depends who's asking. That line probably sounded clever in his head. In real life, it sounded like panic wearing sunglasses. The taller investigator stepped forward calmly. Department of Veterans Affairs Fraud Division. Nobody moved. The Army Ranger near the coffee station leaned back against the wall with folded arms. Several older veterans stared openly now. Brent looked around the room searching for support. Nobody gave him any. You got some kind of mistake, Brent said loudly. The investigator opened the folder. We've received multiple complaints regarding fraudulent fundraising activities, misrepresentation of military service and financial misconduct involving veteran charities. Rick slowly looked toward me. I said nothing, because I truly hadn't reported Brent. I didn't need to. Men like him eventually create enough enemies themselves. The second investigator spoke next. We'd like to ask you some questions. Brent pointed toward me instantly. This is because of her. The room stayed silent. That silence hit harder than shouting would have. Walt stood slowly from his chair near the back wall. Old age had bent his shoulders some, but in that moment he looked taller than his son. No, Walt said quietly. This is because of you. Brent stared at him like he'd been slapped. Dad, enough. One word. Flat. Final. I'd heard commanders use that same tone before missions. The investigators escorted Brent outside while whispers spread through the hall. No handcuffs. No dramatic scene. Honestly, that made it worse. Humiliation is heavier when nobody fights you. Rick remained frozen beside me. You knew, he whispered. I suspected. You never told anybody. Number. Why not? I looked around the hall. At old men wearing faded veteran caps. At widows organizing raffle tickets. At photographs of dead soldiers displayed beside candles. Because this night wasn't supposed to become about him. Rick stared at me for several long seconds. Then, for the first time since we married, I saw genuine shame settle into his face. Brent's collapse happened fast after that. Faster than even I expected. Turns out the federal investigation had already been building for months before the fundraiser incident. The complaints came from multiple states, mostly elderly veterans, a few grieving families, one disabled Marine who'd paid Brent nearly $6,000 for fake advanced tactical certification classes that existed only online. By the following Tuesday, local news stations picked up the story. Not national headlines, just the kind of quiet regional scandal older Americans discuss over diner coffee. Veteran charity fraud investigation expands. Rick sat in his recliner staring at the television while reporters talked about forged credentials and missing donation money. I had no idea, he muttered. That part I believed. Rick wasn't stupid, just trusting. There's a difference. Some people grow older without losing faith in others. That's not weakness either, just expensive kindness. Meanwhile, Brent's social media accounts disappeared almost overnight. Then his business website vanished. Then came rumors. Bank accounts frozen, clients demanding refunds, lawsuits coming, sponsors pulling away. Walt called 3 days later. His voice sounded 20 years older. His wife left, he said quietly. I closed my eyes briefly. Children always pay for grown men's pride eventually. That's hard, I said. He deserves consequences, Walt replied. But his little girl didn't deserve this. No argument there. That night, Rick found me sitting alone on the back porch after midnight. Texas summer air wrapped warm around the yard. Crickets singing. Distant highway noise drifting through darkness. Rick sat beside me carefully. Not too close. Like a man unsure whether he still had permission. I owe you an apology, he said. I kept watching the yard. For what specifically? He gave a weak laugh. Fair question. Then he grew serious again. I didn't trust you. Number. I cared more about what Brent thought than what my own wife said. Yes. Rick rubbed both hands together nervously. I think maybe I wanted you simple. That surprised me enough to finally look at him. What does that mean? He stared into the darkness. You were calm, kind, easy to be around. He swallowed. Finding out you had this whole other life, it scared me. Why? Because I realized I didn't really know what you carried. That one hit closer than he understood. Because carrying things quietly had become my entire personality after enough years. I looked down at my hands, older now, veins showing, arthritis beginning around the knuckles during cold mornings. Hard to imagine those same hands once repelled from helicopters in blackout conditions. I didn't hide things to deceive you, I said softly. Then why? The honest answer took time. Not because I feared saying it. Because I rarely allowed myself to think about it directly anymore. Finally I answered. War follows people home differently. Rick stayed silent. I know men who came home angry, I continued. Others drank themselves numb. Some never emotionally came back at all. I paused. For me, I learned how to become invisible. The porch stayed quiet except for insects humming in the dark. I wanted one small piece of life untouched by all that I said. A normal marriage, grocery stores, backyard dinners, ordinary things. Rick's voice cracked slightly. And I ruined that. No, I said gently. Brent did. But Rick still looked devastated. Because decent men suffer deeply once they realize they failed somebody they love. A week later, Walt visited again. This time alone. No pie today. Just exhaustion. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while Rick repaired something unnecessarily in the garage to give us privacy. Walt looked at me carefully. You know why I recognized you so fast? I've wondered. He nodded slowly. In Vietnam, there were guys who came back loud. He tapped the table lightly, always telling stories, always needing attention. Then he shook his head. But the real dangerous ones, he said quietly. They got quiet afterward. I felt something tighten painfully in my chest. Because older veterans understand truths civilians often miss completely. Walt stared into his coffee. My son spent his life pretending to be something he said. You spent yours trying not to be. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and slid an envelope across the table. No idea what this means, he said. I opened it carefully. Official seal. Washington address. Heavy paper stock. Inside sat a formal invitation. Classified service commendation ceremony. Attendance requested. Date and location included. Nothing more. Rick walked in from the garage carrying a wrench when he saw my expression. What is it? I handed him the letter. He read it once, then again slower. His face changed completely. Because until that moment, some part of him still believed maybe my past had been exaggerated somehow. But governments do not send sealed invitations for imaginary lives. Rick looked up slowly. How much don't I know about you? I folded the letter carefully. Too many answers existed for that question, and none of them came easy. The invitation sat on our kitchen table for 3 days before either of us spoke seriously about it again. Rick kept walking past it like the envelope might explode if he stared too long. I understood the feeling. Some truths arrive quietly, then rearrange the entire house. Thursday evening, he finally asked if he could come with me. We were eating soup at the counter because neither of us felt much like cooking lately. Yes, I said. You sure? I wouldn't have left the letter out if I didn't want you there. Rick nodded slowly. Then he asked the question I'd known was coming. What happened to your first husband? I set my spoon down carefully. His name was Daniel Mercer. Funny thing about grief. Even after 30 years, hearing certain names inside your own head can still physically hurt. Desert Storm, I said quietly. Rick immediately looked regretful. I'm sorry, I shouldn't. No, it's all right. I stared out the kitchen window while memories drifted up slowly like old ghosts through dark water. Danny was Army aviation, I said. Medical evacuation. Rick listened silently. He used to joke helicopters were just lawnmowers with commitment issues. That earned the smallest smile from Rick. I smiled too for half a second. Then it disappeared. He died during a recovery operation, I said. The kitchen became still. No television. No radio. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the pantry. I was 27, I continued. 1 week later, somebody handed me his folded flag. Rick's eyes lowered immediately. Older Americans understand what folded flags mean. You don't need to explain them. I spent a long time angry afterward, I admitted. At who? Everybody. I folded my hands together. The government, the war, God, random strangers buying groceries while my whole world had stopped. Rick swallowed hard. And that's why you enlisted. Yes, you wanted revenge. I thought about that honestly. At first, I said softly, probably. That answer sat heavily between us. Because polite suburban life leaves very little room for conversations about rage. Especially female rage. Rick stared at the table. What changed? I leaned back slowly in my chair. Reality. He looked up. The movies lie, I said. People think combat makes you feel powerful, important, heroic. I shook my head gently. It mostly makes you tired. That one seemed to hit him harder than everything else. Maybe because it sounded so ordinary. Not cinematic. Just human. I lost teammates, I continued quietly. Good people. Smarter people than me sometimes. I paused. And every time you survive something another person doesn't, part of you starts wondering whether survival was luck or theft. Rick rubbed both hands over his face slowly. My God, Diane. I looked at him calmly. Killing someone doesn't make you stronger, I said. It takes things from you. That sentence stayed hanging in the room a long time afterward. The next morning, Brent called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. His voice sounded completely different now. No swagger. No performance. Just exhaustion. Diane, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I leaned against the kitchen counter. For what specifically? A long silence followed. Then he said something I didn't expect. For making sacrifices into a joke. That was closer to truth than anything he'd said before. I stayed quiet. My lawyer says I'll probably avoid prison, he continued weakly. But everything else is gone. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows. Texas summer storms rolling through. What do you want from me, Brent? Another pause. I don't know. At least that answer was honest. Finally, he sighed heavily. My dad won't even look at me. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The real wound. Not money. Not reputation. Disappointing the man whose respect mattered most. Walt loves you, I said calmly. Not anymore. That's not how fathers work. Brent let out a broken laugh. You still defending me after all this? No, I replied, just telling the truth. Silence again. Then very quietly, were you really scared over there? That question surprised me enough to sit down. Because underneath all Brent's arrogance had apparently lived a frightened little boy trying desperately to imitate courage. Yes, I answered honestly. All the time. Yes. Another silence. I thought real warriors weren't afraid. I almost smiled sadly. Fear keeps people alive, Brent. Ego gets them killed. When the call ended, I sat alone for several minutes afterward, thinking about how many men spend their lives pretending not to be scared, and how much damage that pretending causes. 2 days before the ceremony, Walt came by again. This time, Rick invited him onto the porch while I made coffee. The two men sat quietly together for a long while before I joined them. Walt looked tired, but lighter somehow. Brent started volunteering at the Veterans Center, he said. That's good. He says he owes people. I handed him coffee. Maybe he finally understands something. Walt nodded slowly. You know, he said, my generation got taught strange things about toughness. Rick gave a humorless chuckle. That makes 2 generations. Walt looked toward the yard. Back then, men were supposed to be hard all the time. No fear, no tears, no weakness. He shook his head. Turns out that just creates lonely old men. None of us argued. Because by 60, most Americans have buried enough friends to know emotional isolation kills slowly. Rick looked at me carefully. I think I confused gentleness with weakness, too. I reached over and touched his hand. Most people do. His fingers closed around mine carefully. Not possessive. Grateful. That mattered. The morning of the ceremony arrived cloudy and cool. Unusual for August. Rick wore his best gray suit. I wore a dark navy dress and low heels. No medals. No dramatic presentation. Just simplicity. As we drove toward the naval facility outside San Antonio, Rick kept glancing at me nervously. You okay? Yes. You don't seem nervous. I watched highway fences blur past outside the window. I've already survived the hard part. He reached across the console and squeezed my hand gently. And for the first time since this whole mess began, the silence between us finally felt peaceful again. The naval facility sat behind 2 security gates and a stretch of shoreline most tourists would never notice driving past. Gray buildings, neatly trimmed grass, American flags snapping sharply in the wind off the water. The kind of place built more for function than appearance. Rick parked beside a row of government vehicles and turned off the engine slowly. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he looked at me. You really spent your life around places like this. I smiled faintly. Places louder than this. That earned the smallest nervous laugh from him. We walked toward the entrance together. 2 uniformed officers checked identification quietly. The younger one looked at my name, then immediately straightened slightly. Not dramatic. Subtle. Respectful. That old familiar discomfort settled into my chest again. I never got used to that part. Inside the hallway smelled faintly of coffee floor polish and ocean air drifting through distant vents. Military buildings all smell strangely similar no matter the decade. A petty officer escorted us toward a private conference room. As we entered, several people already stood waiting. Some gray-haired, some younger, all carrying themselves with that unmistakable military posture time never fully removes. The room became silent when I walked in. Then one older man stepped forward. Silver hair. Dress whites. Scar near his chin I recognized immediately. Chief Mercer, he said softly. Nobody had called me that in years. I shook his hand. Good to see you, Ben. Rick looked stunned already. Ben smiled toward him politely. Your wife saved my life in 2002. Rick blinked. What? I immediately cut in. Ben exaggerates. No, ma'am, he said calmly. I absolutely do not. More people approached quietly after that. No dramatic speeches, no movie-style applause. Just handshakes. Eye contact. A few hugs. One man simply touched my shoulder and whispered, Good to see you made it home. That one nearly broke me. Because old operators understand exactly what those words mean. Rick stood beside me watching everything carefully. The entire drive here, I think part of him still imagined maybe the truth had grown larger with time. But respect like this can't be faked. Not in rooms like these. A commander eventually approached the front of the room carrying a folder. The ceremony itself stayed small. Private. No cameras. No press. The commander spoke about an operation overseas years earlier involving civilian hostages. Most details remained classified. Names omitted. Locations vague. But certain phrases still landed hard. Extraordinary composure under hostile conditions. Multiple American lives preserved. Voluntary re-entry despite active threat environment. Rick sat motionless beside me. Then came the final sentence. Chief Diane Mercer repeatedly placed herself in mortal danger to ensure the extraction of personnel who otherwise would not have survived. The room stayed silent afterward. Military silence feels different from civilian silence. Heavier. More respectful. The commander handed me the commendation folder. We shook hands. And that was it. No swelling music. No dramatic moment. Just a quiet acknowledgement between people who understood what had been lost earning it. Honestly, that felt right. Afterward, coffee and sandwiches were served in another room overlooking the water. Rick barely spoke for several minutes. Finally, he looked at me and whispered, "You went back in." I stared out toward the shoreline. Yes. Why? Because somebody still needed help? Because training becomes instinct eventually? Because sometimes there isn't time to debate courage? But I answered simply, because they weren't all out yet. Rick's eyes watered immediately. He looked away fast, embarrassed by his own emotion. Men his age were trained to hide tears like state secrets. I touched his hand gently beneath the table. "It's all right." "No," he whispered shakily, "it's not." He swallowed hard. All this time I thought strength meant being loud. He laughed weakly. Turns out I had no idea what it looked like. I squeezed his hand once. Neither of us spoke again for a while. Outside the large windows, waves rolled quietly against the rocks. Peaceful. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary men and women spend lifetimes trying to protect. We were walking toward the parking lot later that afternoon when I saw Brent standing near the security fence, alone, hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. Rick immediately stiffened beside me. "What's he doing here?" Walt stepped out from behind a nearby truck before I could answer. "I brought him," he admitted quietly. Brent looked thinner than before. Smaller somehow. Public humiliation ages people fast. He walked toward us slowly. No swagger left now. No performance. Just a tired, middle-aged man finally stripped of the character he'd spent decades pretending to be. "I won't keep you long," he said. Rick looked ready to explode, but I waited quietly. Brent swallowed hard. "I saw the names inside," he said softly. "The people shaking your hand." I nodded once. His eyes lowered toward the pavement. "You were telling the truth the whole time." "Yes?" Another long silence. Then he looked up. "I'm sorry." Not polished. Not rehearsed. Real. For what I asked gently. His voice cracked slightly. For mocking sacrifices I never understood. Wind moved softly across the parking lot. Somewhere nearby a flag cable tapped rhythmically against a pole. Brent rubbed his face roughly. My whole life I wanted people to think I was tough. Nobody interrupted him. But real tough people. He shook his head slowly. They don't talk like I did. No argument there. Finally, he looked directly at me. "How do you live with the things you've seen?" I thought about that carefully, then answered honestly. "You don't move on from things like that," I said. "You move forward carrying them." Brent nodded slowly like somebody hearing truth for the first time in years. Then I added quietly, "Respect isn't something you wear, Brent. People see it in how you treat others." His eyes filled immediately. He nodded once more, and for the first time since I met him, he didn't try to defend himself. 3 months later, things looked different. Rick and I started rebuilding honestly. No more hiding. No more pretending. Some nights we talked for hours. Other nights we sat quietly on the porch holding hands while Texas cicadas filled the darkness. That counted too. Walt and Brent slowly repaired their relationship. Not quickly. Real healing rarely happens quickly. But Brent kept volunteering at the Veterans Center every week. No tactical shirts anymore. No fake stories. Just work. Helping old men into wheelchairs. Driving widows to appointments. Listening more than talking. Funny how humility changes people. One Sunday evening, our family gathered again for another backyard barbecue. Different mood this time. Softer. "Kinder,"